because we're just being conditioned by the news flow, I think, to look for relief where markets want it, so to speak. And this news that President Trump is putting that pause on the global reciprocal sounds like a great thing. But to your absolute point, we have extraordinary tariffs now on goods between the world's biggest two economies. It would now be over 125% on Chinese goods coming into the US. China is the third largest source of goods for the US after Mexico and the EU. And then, of course, China is retaliating with 85% tariffs, 85% tariffs on US goods, but also lots of warnings there about non-tariff retaliatory measures as well. So the point is the world's biggest two economies are locked in an extraordinary trade war. We haven't seen this before. It is, of course, going to impact prices more so in the US economy, and growth and economic activity in both economies. And the key point is that there's no real sense of an off-ramp just now. I mean, we've had the officials out this morning, Jameson Greer, trade representative yesterday and today, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent yesterday and today, making the point that they're not saying there's any olive branches coming from Beijing. And of course, Beijing certainly would make the point that it's up to Washington to come and talk to them. So no hint of an off-ramp, very new territory and very, very serious stuff for the world economy.
Well, just give us some numbers here, Enda, about how crucial of a trading partner China is. I was telling Gina Martin-Adams earlier that the move in Apple confuses me to the upside of close to 10% at this point, because it is a company that relies so much on China. We had Dan Ives on earlier this week from Wedbush, and he basically said, if you look at the Mag 7 companies, if you look at all the tech companies, this is the one that is most exposed to China. So why, in your view, are we not seeing a reaction negatively to Apple?
Yeah, well, look, in the case of Apple, I don't know the idiosyncratics, but it might be the case that people think they can diversify out of China, and they will do. I mean, they've been flagging, investments in other parts of the world, India, for example, some in the US. So it might be a diversification story. But to your broader point, the big issue is that the US remains, China remains a critical source of both consumer goods and intermediate goods for the US. And I think the figure is around 30% of all imports into the US really rely on coming out of China, right? They depend on China. There's stuff that's made there that isn't made anywhere else in the world. And when you speak to businesses here, manufacturers and others in the US, they will tell you time and time again, they buy certain components from China because it's A, the most competitive place they can source them, and B, some of that stuff is not made anywhere else in the world. These kind of industrial intermediate goods are made in China, that's what they do, and that's where they source them. So this is going to be very complicated for US business. It's going to be very complicated for US households and consumers. Remember, also getting lost in the tariff news on China is the de minimis changes.
Good point.
The lower income, and there's literature that suggests lower income households rely on the de minimis purchases. They're going to get hurt. That's about 90% now. So yes, a big relief on the global trade story today, but the China-US story is only getting started.
Well, that's where I want to follow up, and something you said that, there's no looking for an off-ramp between U.S. and China. Is that because, Enda, there is no off-ramp? I mean, we have talked about decoupling between the United States and China for a long time, but they need each other. Is that correct?
No, they do need each other. We wrote about this. We wrote about this today. Decoupling had gone off the agenda. It was all about de-risking. And by coincidence, by the way, 1 year ago this week, then Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen delivered remarks in Beijing saying the US and China would never decouple. To do so would be disastrous for both economies. 1 year later, here we are talking about 125% tariffs in one direction and 80-odd in the other direction. So they can't fully decouple, but we're a lot closer to it than we thought they were. You will start to see supply chain shift. Companies will have to move their production around. There's no question about it. Consumers will start changing up where they're buying their stuff from. And then in terms of where can there be a deal, we can't necessarily speculate, but we know President Trump talks about China has to bring down all of their barriers to allow more US investment and trade in China. So that's around IP protection, the currency, the exchange rate, that kind of thing. I'm not quite sure what China would be demanding per se, but it's not. And of course, the other part, I should also say, part of the mix could be more Chinese investment in the US is one possibility people talk about. But either way, those are talking points. We're at extraordinary levels of tariffs. The rhetoric from both sides, China says they will fight to the end. President Trump showing no signs of a climb down on the China side either. Right now we're still at the retaliatory phase. Negotiations seem some way off between the both of them.
And what's the impetus or what's the motivation for a company that has a supply chain based in China or significantly exposed to China to move to another country right now when just last week we heard tariffs announced on pretty much every single country in the world? Trump 1.0, I imagine, and during Trump's first term, we saw that, and we did see that with many companies. But just last week, they were punished as a result of these tariffs. I guess what I'm saying is, since there's no certainty there, and those other tariffs could come back if there is retaliation, why would a company make an investment such as that?
And that's completely the issue. Companies are confused. I speak to companies all the time. They say, we'd love to move out of China, but nowhere else offers the scale and the infrastructure that China has, or the costs. And anyway, even if we did move, what happens if we get caught up in a tariff dragnet, which is, to the point you're talking about? And by the way, a lot of these manufacturers that we speak to also make the point they would love to come back and produce in America, but it is just too expensive, too costly, regulatory environment, environmental burdens, skill set, all the rest of it makes it very hard to do so. So there's a kind of school of thought out there among corporate executives that let's just hang tight, ultimately see how this goes over the next year, 2 years before they make real big capex decisions. But if you're a smaller company on thin margins, which a lot of these operators are, you can't cope with a 125% tariff.
What does the president, I am curious, the president has talked in the past about being kind of a friend with President Xi, right? A great relationship. What does he really ultimately want from China and President Xi here?
Well, we have to get that articulated. But as you say, over the years, President Trump has veered between something of China Hulk, obviously, to willing to do business with China. We saw that, of course, during the TikTok back and forth. Again, one would expect the ask from the US side is around better market access into China, freer market access. IP theft is a big issue there. The exchange rate, obviously, President Trump says they keep the exchange rate too low. Treasury Secretary Bessent warning about that this morning. That's one side of it. And maybe also, sometimes there has been a hint from the administration that China could come and invest here more. That would be seen as a positive. But, we can't go too far down the world of the speculative route because we don't quite yet know what the specific asks are. But one would assume it'll be around trade and investment.
Right.
But as I say, we're not at the negotiating stage yet. We're still in the retaliatory stage.
I am curious, too, what you guys are hearing there at the D.C. Bureau about what is going on inside the White House when it comes to U.S. and China. I think there was a headline overnight from Reuters about maybe U.S. and China talking today or China planning to talk with the U.S. Do we have any clarity around that or any transparency around that?
I don't think certainly the signals from the White House in terms of the public commentary does not lend itself towards anything meaningful near term in terms of negotiations. As you say, both sides have retaliated. China only yesterday, the US again today. We're still in that tit for tat stage. That will have to cool down before real talks get going. And I think there's no sign of anything meaningful on that front just yet, Carol.